Welcome. This presentation is on abstract preparation best practices. Anytime you are submitting your research to a conference, whether it be the Graduate Research Forum internally at the Chicago School, or to an external conference such as APA, these are going to be some helpful tips for how to put together an abstract that you then submit, and once it's reviewed, hopefully it gets accepted, and then you actually get to present your work at the conference. So generally speaking, an abstract is a summary of the content that you're going to present at the conference. And for example, at the GRF, it's going to be a poster session. That's not always the case. It could be a 15-minute talk that you give as part of a session, an hour-long session. It could be a different form that is unique to a specific conference, but generally speaking, the point of the abstract is, again, to summarize what you're going to be presenting. And it should be concise. About 200 to 300 word limits are typically expected. It should be accurate. Now what this means is that while it has to be general by virtue of being relatively short, it should still accurately describe the content of the research. So it should be reflective of the study content, as it says here. And it should also be unbiased, meaning that you have to use an academic writing style. So for example, you shouldn't have things such as "I think" or make unsubstantiated claims without being able to back them up with scientific evidence. So if you know something is the case based on having read a study that showed that there's a certain phenomenon out there in the world, you shouldn't just make sort of unsubstantiated statements. Now there's also things that you should avoid. In addition to what you should have, you should also avoid quotations in an abstract. And you should also avoid too much detail. This goes along with this idea of being general. So you shouldn't include a full literature review. You shouldn't try to squeeze that in there. You shouldn't squeeze every last procedure if you did an empirical study. You shouldn't include detailed statistics if you have actual results to present. Again, it should be general, but precise in terms of being an overview of what your study is all about. There are a few other considerations that I'd like to mention as well. The first is that the abstract works in conjunction with the title of your submission. And it goes from general to specific. So the title is obviously going to give the audience a very general idea of what your research is all about. And then you should write the title in conjunction with the abstract so that they help each other, so to speak. The title sets them up and the abstract knocks them down, so to speak. I mentioned word limits briefly. They are unique to each conference. Again, typically 300 words or less. The title word limit is typically about 12 words. APA recommends no more than 12 words for journal articles. So the same should apply to conferences throughout. Just keep that in mind. If you can't get it to under 12 words or 12 words or less, then you should rethink how you're writing the title. Now, specific to the GRF, if you're going to be submitting to this internal conference at the Chicago School, the word limit is actually 300 words. You should be able to get in under that, but certainly not more than that. And finally, there are also keywords that you can include. These are typically used for indexing and planning by organizers. So if you use a keyword, if you're going to a conference on, say, anxiety, then using the keyword anxiety might be a little bit too general, right? But if you're going to something like APA, then anxiety might be more appropriate because there are so many different sessions at APA, such a huge conference, that anxiety will help narrow it down for them. And typically the keywords that you would use are ones that you've already identified from the literature, and I'll show you a few examples of keywords that are used depending on the area that you're that you're interested in. The examples we're going to be looking at here are from internet addiction. Anyway, the other point of keywords is for searching by people who are going to attend the conference. So there's always a convention program, and when it's well put together, you can look in an index and see, you know, there's a poster session and I'm interested in, let's just say, anxiety. Then I go to the index and see that, oh, there are several posters, you know, over there that I need to go check out. Okay, so with that, the next topic that I want to sort of talk about is the type of study and the degree of completion. These are the variables that can help you kind of organize how to go about putting your abstract together. Depending on, for example, which combination of these you have, you will use different tenses. For example, past tense, future tense. Especially if you're, you know, if you're only planning your study now, you'll be using future tense. But if you've already, you know, completed an empirical study, then you would be using past tense, right? Things of this sort. But these are the kinds of studies that are typically presented at conferences, including the GRF, and these are the different degrees of completion. Regardless of what type of study you have, you know, there's always going to be a place for you to fit in terms of the conference's overall program. So keep these in mind as you're writing your abstract. And what I want to do now is look at each one of these different study types in turn. Regardless of what degree of completion they are, there is certainly a different approach to each study type. So first, let's look at literature review. The things you'd want to include are the problem under investigation. Certainly, that's sort of the theme of the study, right? The literature inclusion and exclusion criteria. What this means is, you know, what did you do to find the literature that was included? And typically, what this boils down to is indicating what database or databases you used, what keywords you used, often the dates within which you included literature, and depending on the field, that's going to vary. Certainly something like internet addiction, if you have a study from 1945 that talks about internet addiction, I wouldn't really trust that as a scientific study, more like a science fiction study. But you know, that really depends on the field. And certainly there are populations that are an inclusion criterion. So if you're interested in anxiety in you know, Caucasian Americans ages 18 to 25, then certainly you wouldn't want to include literature on African Americans age 65 to 75, right? It wouldn't be pertinent. So then another piece that you have to include in this kind of abstract is the conclusions, implications, and applications. Excuse me. So essentially, a literature review will typically reveal themes. Oftentimes there are conflicting themes, which is actually a good thing because then it points to future directions. And it ties in with this next point of the current state and limitations of knowledge. So if there's a contradiction between, you know, one set of studies and another set of studies, then it's pointing to the fact that there has to be more work done to try to figure out why there is no consensus. And then that certainly points to this last piece of suggestions for practice and or future empirical studies. So if there is a consistent theme that emerges, then certainly you can use that to help attendees at the conference understand implications for their practice, or if there are not consistencies, if there are inconsistencies, then you can use that to draw those out and you know, maybe collaborate with folks who show up to your poster, or you know, at least get an idea for a study that could be conducted either by you as a dissertation or by other interested parties. Okay, so let me give you an example of all this. This is the first page of an article titled "The Association Between Internet Addiction and Psychiatric Disorder: A Review of the Literature." And you have the authors there, their affiliations, the title of the journal is up here. It's European Psychiatry, volume 27 from 2012, pages 1 to 8. So you can definitely track this article down if you want. What I want to focus on, though, is not all this information. I want to focus on the abstract and the keywords. So that's what's on this slide here. Now, in 169 words, I pasted it into Word and did a word count. They accomplish all of the goals that I just outlined in the previous summary of what to include. They have the problem under investigation, obviously the title about the association between internet addiction and psychiatric disorder pretty much sums it up, right? And then they indicate that it's a review of the literature, so it's a pretty good title. They list their literature inclusion and exclusion criteria. You see here they say, we have recruited articles mentioning coexisting psychiatric disorders of internet addiction from the PubMed database as at November, I'm pretty sure that's supposed to say as of November 3rd, 2009. So that tells you, what general area, what general sort of population of literature they're looking through. They don't necessarily include the keywords they used, but that can certainly be something to do. And then they talk about the population they included, and subsequently the conclusions, implications, and applications. So the populations that they included, they list the disorders that were included here. So they talk about substance use disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, hostility, and social anxiety disorder. All of these things are what they were interested in, so it tells you what exactly they were looking at. And then finally, the conclusions, implications, applications piece, they basically talk about the comorbidity and how it exists in terms of internet addiction and psychiatric disorder. So that is something that can be used by clinicians, therapists, to help their clients, and also to guide research in the future. And they also explore the themes that they found. So certainly all of these things come together to form a good abstract. And also down here, remember I talked about keywords, right? So they also include the keywords that are pertinent to their particular study. Now for your specific work, it's obviously going to be a unique situation, but it gives you some idea within the ballpark of this abstract what kinds of keywords were appropriate. Okay, so the next type of study that you can present at a conference would be a theory-oriented presentation. So the main idea is to kind of describe a theory and its implications. So the principles on which the theory or theories are based is the very first thing you want to include. So you can, for example, juxtapose theories and then highlight the piece that is central to what your theory is all about. So technically, you can develop your own theory based on a literature review, right, and understand that you are borrowing from previous theories, and by juxtaposing them, you essentially indicate what the historical background of your particular theory actually is. Then you want to describe how the theory actually works. You want to talk about the phenomena or the problems that are accounted for by your theory. You also want to sketch connections between your theory and actual data, meaning that there can be a certain empirically obtained phenomenon, so something that has been observed out in the world, whether in an experiment or an observational study, or maybe even through experience treating clients. You can identify how your theory fits those data really well and can explain those data really well. And then some conclusions. You want to talk about the pros and cons of your theory. So its utility in terms of explaining the phenomena that you're interested in explaining, and if there are any anomalies. Now anomalies, what these are is, things that under your theory don't make sense. Something that's an anomaly under one theory is not an anomaly under another one. So for example, the very generic example, under the theory that the world is flat, you can't account for the fact that a ship goes over the horizon and then is able to return, because under a flat world theory, the ship would have fallen off the edge of the world and there's no coming back, right? But under a theory in which the world is round, that stops being a problem because the ship can just turn right around and it's just on a curve, right? So it's no longer an anomaly that a ship can come back from beyond the horizon. Okay, so in addition to those pros and cons, you also want to have suggestions for advancement of theory and potential empirical tests of the theory. So what this means is just sort of future directions, like how could you use this theory to design a study that would really evaluate whether it's solid or not. And anomalies are a great way to do that, because if you set up a good study, then you can basically test whether or not your study can, or your theory can account for certain phenomena that are out there. And then certainly suggestions for practice. The idea being that from a certain clinical perspective, i.e. a theory, an approach that you have for practice, it can be a good lens through which to understand problems and solutions. Okay, so again, let's look at an example. Going back to internet addiction, this particular article in Computers and Human Behavior, volume 31 from 2014, is a conceptual and methodological critique of internet addiction research towards a model of compensatory internet use. Whew, that's a mouthful, right? But again, the title works in conjunction with the abstract. So let's look at the abstract in a little bit more detail. I don't want to take too much time reviewing this. Suffice it to say that they cover all the ground that I outlined in the previous slide. So what you can do is go ahead, pause this presentation, or download the article. It's available through Google Scholar or through PsycInfo. Have it read through and see what you make of it. Meanwhile, I'm going to continue. Okay, so let's look at the next type of study that you can present, a case study. A case study is basically looking at a particular client or a historical case, maybe something that exemplifies a particular kind of phenomenon or theory. So what you want to include is, first of all, the subject and the relevant characteristics. So the person and maybe, they're male, they're a certain age, they're a certain ethnicity, and they have a certain, syndrome that you describe in some detail, not too much detail again, but you want to, sort of describe what the issues are, right? You also want to talk about the problem that the case actually illustrates. So sort of tie it in with the overall framework that that exists out there for understanding how this case ties in with something like anxiety or something like what we're looking at, internet addiction, right? So the example we'll look at will kind of flesh this out a little bit. The treatment that was used in the case study. Sometimes there isn't a treatment. Sometimes you just describe a syndrome or a person's particular set of circumstances. But typically, there would be some treatment involved, right? We're talking about clinical cases a lot of the time. Now, the pertinent outcomes are obviously something that you'd want to talk about. Depending on how effective the treatment was, you would have identified meaningful outcomes and whether or not there was improvement, and kind of describe the nature of the improvement. So it can be quantitative or qualitative. And then finally, the implications for practice and or theory. Now this, you have to hedge this a little bit with case studies because they are individual cases. So what works for one person might not work for another. But at the same time, if you're in a sort of really novel area, or it's a unique kind of case, then somebody who comes to visit your poster and wants to know more, they certainly want to see that you've put in some thought about what the implications of this case are for practice and or theory. So you should definitely have at least some information on that in the abstract. Okay, so again, let's look at an example. Here we have a study titled Internet Addiction Disorder and Problematic Use of Google Glass in Patient Treated at a Residential Substance Abuse Treatment Program. That's a mouthful. I would say that title is a tiny bit too long, but in keeping with the theme of internet addiction, Google Glass has been a recent phenomenon that has been kind of lambasted in the popular media and social media as well. So certainly it's something that has garnered some attention, but not a lot of work has been done in terms of how people get addicted to Google Glass. So this is a case study that could be of interest. Now what's interesting about this abstract, again, I'm just going to zoom in, so to speak, is that they broke it down. You see there's an introduction, a method, and results. So now this one, and I'm sorry, and conclusions as well. So this one, you have the freedom to do this as well, as long as you can squeeze it into 300 words. It's certainly a valid way to describe the case. And so again, feel free to pause it. You can download this this article as well, have a read through. Meanwhile, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so the last type of study that I want to review in this presentation is an empirical study. So this is a sort of most frequently found type of work that's presented at conferences. What you want to include is the problem under investigation, the sample size and pertinent demographics, the method, the results, the conclusions, implications, and applications. So similar to the previous types of studies, but here when we're talking about method and results, you want to be a little bit more specific, because the method and results are the probably the most important parts of an empirical study. How did you go about studying the problem, and what did you find? Right? Again, it has to be somewhat general. You don't want to include exact statistics, but you want to talk about any significant effects and the variables that were part of the study. Sometimes it's observational, in which case that's a method. You want to go into a little bit of detail about that. Other times it's experimental. You want to indicate what variables you manipulated and what variables you measured as dependent variables or as outcomes, whatever terminology you want to use. And so with this kind of study, there is going to be more of a focus on the overall patterns in the data, right? Because with an empirical study, typically you study a relatively large group of participants, and then the conclusions and implications are more along the lines of, what can this tell us about the problem under investigation in general, in terms of the overall population that you studied, or in terms of people in general. It depends on the method, but you would certainly have conclusions and implications that are more generalizable than in a case study, for example. Okay, so let's look at an example. Again, this comes from Computers in Human Behavior from 2014. And it's titled Exploring the Effects of Demographic Factors, Internet Usage, and Personality Traits on Internet Addiction in a Sample of Italian University Students. Very descriptive title, and a relatively short abstract, and yet they still accomplish what an abstract sets out to do. So again, let's zoom in. And so here, please again, feel free to pause or download the article, and I am going to keep going. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the GRF itself. There are some submission logistics. The deadline was April 1st. It's been extended to April 10th. The submission portal, you have the address there. There's a form that you fill out, and it's all online. You don't download a form, you just kind of fill in fields so you can write up your abstract and keywords and everything in a Word document and then just paste it into the website. The way to actually get there, if you don't want to have to, copy all this text down and type it in, you just go to my.thechicagoschool.edu, click on Student Affairs, and then the Graduate Research Forum. So you can just follow those links and it will take you to the submission portal. Now, note that one thing I forgot to mention is that if you're doing an empirical study and you're in the process of collecting data, you can talk about tentative results, because by the time that you submit, you may have 1 or 2 data points, but by the time that the actual GRF rolls around, you've already collected all your data and you've already analyzed it. So that's okay. You don't have to have completed the study. You can still be in the process of conducting it, in which case you would have language such as the results and implications will be presented, right? So that way you kind of account for the fact that it's a work in progress. Like I mentioned, the stage of completion of the study can be anything, especially for the GRF. Okay, and the last thing is that there is assistance available to you through NCAID. You can email the eTutors, and they will review your abstract and provide feedback. Again, looking at things in terms of having included all of the pertinent information, any ambiguities that you may have not noted, and also any kinds of grammatical issues. So that can certainly be a useful piece of information. With that, that concludes the presentation. So I thank you for your attention and wish you luck in submitting your work.